I'm just going to pop up the agenda. Everybody see that okay?
Yep.
Okay. It's a little late start, 12:05. This is the Harbor Plan Committee meeting of August 11th. Rick Noonan is the chair, has not joined us yet, but I'll just read the preamble. Pursuant to Section 20 of Chapter 20 of the Acts of 2021, this meeting will be conducted via remote participation. Additionally, all votes taken by the Harbor Plan Committee during this and future remote meetings will be by roll call vote. If there is a public comment period, if you're calling on a phone, you can press *9 to request to speak. If you're watching from a computer or device, there's a raise hand button that you can tap or press to request to speak. The meeting will be recorded and made available on the city's website in accordance with the state open meeting law. So call order, and Tony Gross will be sitting in as vice chair for the moment.
All right, Rick. So introduction to staff, we don't have any minutes to approve, correct?
Correct. We'll get those out in advance of the next meeting.
Okay, so I'll start out. That was Greg Catamatori, city planner. Then we have member John McCarthy. Let me get and we have member Tom Balfe. Tessa Brown. And I saw Vito Gigaloni. And I believe that's all the members. And then with us is also with the planning department is Gemma Wilkins. And then Will Cohen. Oh, Katie Cal. Cal, is that how you say it, Katie?
It's Call.
Katie Call is also a member. And we have Tiskina Tareen, Matthew Little. Sorry, Christina.
You're fine.
And we have Jason Helendrum as and Zoe Muller and Richard Jabba. And I believe that is everyone who is here today.
Okay. So I think the bulk of this meeting is going to be a presentation from the consultant team. Since we last met and reviewed the kind of nuts and bolts of the DPA environment and a little bit about harbor planning in general and what can be accomplished through the process. The next step was to be working on some of the preliminary analysis of the economics, our kind of current snapshot, which will be built on further as we move forward into additional meetings on this topic, and also some preliminary insights on risk in the harbor as well from a flooding and climate change perspective. So I'll just kind of turn it over to the UTL team, led by UTL, to kind of give you a presentation. We thought about having this to you in advance. It's kind of meaty, but we'll probably have another session. We'll have time at the end of this presentation to get into some interaction and questions surrounding the presentation, but probably will take another meeting to do a little bit more of that as well, because it's a lot to absorb. I'll turn it over to Matt.
Before, do you want to say anything, Matt? Or you want to give it to me?
I'll hand it over to you, Will.
Okay. Is my screen visible? I just want to make sure before I go too far. I see nodding heads. Okay, great, wonderful. So thank you all for being here. I think it's worth saying right at the outset that this is very much preliminary information, right? This has been called the Economic Strategy Baseline Summary. And so while we're still waiting on some additional reports and information being published, I think that a lot of the big pieces that we're looking at here can guide us going forward. And so it'll be a good chance for you to ask questions as we're going through this and just sort of see how the direction is shaping up. So the way we're going to go through this is the first thing that I'll go through, 1 and 2, really. I'll talk a little bit about the engagement and all the work we've done to date, and then sort of tee up the idea of what we are talking about with this idea of blue economy that I think we've been hearing a lot about and that many of you have mentioned. From there, between Kevin and Jason, we'll talk about the actual economic baseline and about resilience and infrastructure, and then I'll do a little bit of wrap up and closing this out. Okay, so I am not going to read through all of this information. I'll sort of leave it up as I talk to you a little bit about it, but we've done a lot of interviews collectively as a team with Greg and the city's help with many of you in the committee, and we're sort of beginning the process of thinking about some other ones. And a lot of what the takeaways were centered around are the big idea about trajectory, what's going on in the city today, where things are going, how it fits into the larger regional changes, as well as a lot of concrete possible policy steps that we could be going in. And a big piece of it is about how this is framed to the idea of the master plan and the MHP, specifically. And so, there's these 4 questions that I think most of the observations did fall into. The role of Gloucester as things shifting north, as well as shifting into different kinds of, seafood and catch. What that means for the future of Gloucester as a port, what that means for the DPA specifically, and then also for the leverage that's actually available to the city, right? And MHP doesn't control everything. In many ways, it's just regulatory stuff happening. And so that final question, especially when most of the harbor is private, is particularly serious. What that has led us to, and this is where we are sort of going right now, moving forward as we move out of pure economic questions and some more ideas of spatial stuff, is something which is, I think, a little bit more specific than happened for the last MHP, right? For the last MHP, we did kind of think about different zones and their breakdown by type and use, but in many ways, the regulatory changes were fairly broad across the DPA, or they were about boundary revisions and recalculations. And what we're thinking now is that it would actually make a lot of sense as we're moving into more detailed things to really categorize the DPA area and the harbor area by commonality. And so we've got these 5 different zones, and you can see that number 5 actually is in 2 different locations, right? But there's sort of the downtown and how that relates to the rest of the city, actually, because that part of the harbor isn't really just harbor. In many ways, it's the edge of downtown. There's Harbor Cove with all of the really specific challenges and issues facing those particular property owners. There's the stuff in and around the fish pier and the big lot. There's the area which in many ways we now have less leverage over, the area that's been taken out of the DPA, but hasn't necessarily shifted dramatically in the last couple of years. It's still really marine industrial, but without the same level of regulatory oversight. And then there's the stuff next to it all, which maybe still is in the DPA, but is now that residential character area. And these are all really different from one another. The needs are different. The potential policy differences are different. And it makes sense for us to think about these areas as different things that need to be tackled themselves. And so that's sort of where we're going from here. And the reason why that matters a lot is because each of those different areas relates a lot different to sort of this big idea of the blue economy, which we've been hearing a lot about. And so the report that's coming up, the North Shore Blue Economy Report, we don't have it yet. And so it's worth saying that much of the detail about how specifically the blue economy is going to relate to Gloucester, we're still awaiting some of that information ourselves. But even though that isn't here yet, it is worth thinking about what that means, because I think there's not necessarily a common definition between everyone on the committee. And so it's worth knowing that, this is looking at the 2017 report on the Massachusetts maritime economy, and that this is, I think, useful for us to talk about because this framework about the different economic sectors is the common way of thinking about blue economy sectors. And this framework is how we propose to sort of think about this. And it's worth us talking about because that'll be how the data is presented going forward. And I think what's key here is that many of the different sectors in not just the Gloucester Harbor, but many of them all fit into this broader idea of the blue economy. It's not just tech, right? It could be anything from, transportation and warehousing, which, is absolutely a part of what's right on the waterfront of Gloucester, to things which aren't necessarily even present yet, like wind and other kinds of energy production, to some of those more technical uses that we haven't seen just yet. And so these, 6 categories really in many ways encompass all of that. But what is important to know is that within the blue economy, that other idea of blue tech and R&D is very much there across all of the sectors. And so as we look toward how to fit that into the blue economy, there's many ways in, potentially. And I think from here, I'll pass it to Kevin.
Hi, welcome all. My name is Kevin Hively. I'm with Ninegrit Partners. I'm part of the consulting team responsible for some of the economic analysis to support the harbor plan. Before we begin, I just want to say one quick thing. It's important to recognize and remember that particularly local economic data tends to lag for a couple of years. And so it's because of the way it gets reported from the federal level and then gets quote unquote cleaned at the local level. So you're going to see data that a lot of it's going to be pre-COVID. And so clearly there's been some impact on COVID, but it's the best that we have at a level, at the city level. And I'm not going to read all these, but basically the Gloucester's economy has performed pretty well. We're going to walk through what kind of the blue economy / maritime economy looks like and what those component pieces are. The fisheries question and the seaport, the fish port activity of Gloucester is really kind of a question of the eye of the beholder, which we're going to get into. Gloucester is one of the top 10 to 15 locations in the US for seafood processing. It's a growing industry globally, but it's also a consolidating industry, which also has important implications. And then this last piece about tourism is that Gloucester's tourism sector is pretty seasonal. Next. So on a wage base, it fluctuates it fluctuates within about 500 or so jobs, give or take in a year for a variety of reasons. There's about 11,000 jobs in Gloucester. The city is very highly concentrated in manufacturing. There's this economic geographer concept called location quotient, which is basically a way to think about concentration. And you measure it against the United States. Typically, the United States equals 1, Gloucester is 1.75, which means it's, another way to think about it is it's 75% higher than the nation overall in concentration. And I should also say that manufacturing jobs also includes ship repair and in seafood processing, but it does not include seafood wholesale. That's a different business. And then the big gain has been in hospitality and leisure jobs. The wage base, it's 641 million. Again, manufacturing plays an outside role. One of the things that statistics that's actually very interesting, and I think it's very important to think about what are the nature of the kinds of businesses that are in Gloucester in manufacturing, is that the wage is higher. The manufacturing wage, the average manufacturing wage is higher than the Massachusetts manufacturing wage. And that is likely a function of the fact that you have a series of businesses, including the seafood industry, that have CEOs, that have high-level business managers, that have engineers, have product development officials, not just people working on a line. The other thing that is very interesting is that only about a third of Gloucester's jobs are actually filled by Gloucester's residents. And about 8,600 people from Gloucester leave Gloucester to find work elsewhere in Cape Ann and across the North Shore.
Kevin, I guess, Craig, since I'm running the meeting now, I don't have to raise my hand, huh? I didn't see anything on the healthcare industry.
This is a very condensed deck of a much longer presentation. The healthcare and social services is the third largest industry in Gloucester.
Is that under the manufacturing or is it?
No, it's in the other bucket.
Where is the other bucket?
It's the gray.
Oh, okay. Oh, all right. It's not in the, okay. I see. Got it. And it's the largest in that
It's
other.
the third, it's the largest, it's the third largest in the city.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Next. So we, for those of you who don't know, we were involved in the prior harbor plan. And so we basically replicated the work we did the last time to try to get a handle around what the rough size of the blue economy is. And we broke it up into these categories. So marine education, advocacy, research, and innovation, that includes everything from Gloucester Maritime to Ocean Alliance to CGMI, the NOAA office, et cetera. And how we basically put those together, because they're not going to show up in any simple statistic. How we put that together was going through and looking at, particularly for the nonprofits, is looking at what's known as their Form 990, which is essentially the equivalent of a nonprofit tax return. Those are available online. They, again, lag a couple of years, so we were able to figure out, that's where we piece together the jobs and wages numbers for that. The seafood industry includes seafood processing as well as wholesale. And you can see what the wages and numbers are there. And again, this is going to be for 2019. Fishing and fleet services. So the fleet services includes things like ice, ship repair, et cetera, plus the fishing fleet. There's an important caveat here. And this is something, if it's something that people want to get a better handle on, we're going to need help doing this. We were able to do it the last time. As you all know, there is a substantial number of employees who work in the fishing and including in the ship repair business who are 1099 employees. They are basically contract workers and they do not show up in payroll. And these numbers are based upon payroll statistics. The last time we did this, we were able to talk to a couple of the settlement accountants who deal with the payouts from the boats to give us an idea of how many more people were involved, because this number is low. And we know this number is low. And if that's something that we feel is better to get a more accurate representation, I could not find the information of who those settlement people were. I'm not even sure if they're still around. But if anybody can help us make that contact, if they think we want to be able to flesh this number out, we would need that help to do that. And then the tourism number is an estimate. If you go, when you see the larger deck, it'll show you how we basically came up with that calculation. I'm going to walk through a little bit of it later to give a flavor of how we adjusted for the seasonality, because it feels like if you look at the number before, you're like, well, leisure and hospitality business is already bigger than the tourism owner. Why is it smaller? And it's because we wanted to take into effect the seasonality, because the leisure and hospitality number overstates the tourism business because, all of you there go out to eat, as an example. So the question was how to grab that next level of information out, and we'll walk through that, how we handled that. Next. So the fishing industry, you can read what's there. The fishing industry is in the midst of a transition. Again, it depends upon which way you see it. There's been changes in landing value, but that's a function of the increasing role of lobstering, which you guys have talked about in the interviews. And what's very interesting is something that we did, because we did not have this information in 2013. On a capacity and activity basis, even though New Bedford's much bigger in terms of dollar volume and float, in terms of just activity and capacity, Gloucester is very comparable. Next. So what we did here is to make this easier to see and not have it distorted by the dollar numbers. We took all of the in this case, pounds, and index them against what the number was in 2014 to use basically the timing of the last harbor plan as the base, or the prior year as the base. And what you can see in the top line, which is Gloucester, is basically the gray line that starts at the 108 and then goes down to 80. What you see is, compared to like the US total, which is the green line underneath, overall, Gloucester's done better than, except for the last year or so, has done better than fishing ports overall in the United States. And what you see there with New Bedford is New Bedford had a substantial fall and has more or less stayed pretty level. And then the one that was very interesting and what caught a lot of people was an idea of a lot of people's attention the last time, which was Portland, Maine. Portland, Maine has dropped dramatically. So again, you know, it's not where it used to be, but relative to how the industry overall is performing, you're in pretty good shape. Next. Then we looked at value, and this is where lobstering comes into play. Again, the gray line is value, and you can see that with the exception of Point Judith, which is the dotted yellow line, Gloucester has outperformed every other port, every one of these other comparison ports, and substantially outperformed the nation as a whole. And that largely has to do with the role of lobster in the port.
I just want to recognize Tony Vito raised his hand for a question or a comment.
Sure.
Thanks for recognizing that. I just wanted to point out, I think the reduction in volume is directly related to the semi-pelagic fishery herring. They've had a 95% reduction in their allowable landings, and I believe Cape Seafoods is probably the largest in the herring fleet. So they land a big proportion of the quota. So that could be masking what's really happening there. I think a big part of the loss has been that. I don't think the groundfish landings overall have been down. If anything, they've been increasing over the last 7 or 8 years.
Yeah, and the Vito, in the bigger deck, that backup data shows what you just said.
Very good.
A herring is still the largest by pounds catch, and groundfish is second, but by value, lobster's 1, groundfish is 2, herring's 3rd. So there's more detail in the big deck.
Mm-hmm.
Next.
Kevin, what's Point Judith landing that they're outperforming us in money?
Calamari, squid, and clams, and some lobster. What's very interesting as an aside, and this goes to your point, none of these fishing ports really, the money's not in the fish. Let's put it that way. A lot of the money is in scallops, squid, lobster, New Bedford. It's clams also play a massive role. It's really quite interesting.
Now, in any of your work, did you see where the fish that are being landed in Gloucester, where they're being processed?
No, we have got some shipping data, but some of it's in the big deck. But the short answer is no. But a lot of the catch, the monkfish, dogfish, etc., that is caught is exported out.
Well, that would be a really good thing to know, because those are jobs that are, highly valued around our waterfront that, would be, if we could process them here, that would be a good thing. So some way you guys can try to guide us in that. I think that's an important thing, not to be ignored. So thanks.
Yep, next. And this is some information that Noah's put together. And Jason, if you want to jump in a little bit to make sure I don't say anything wrong. But what you're basically seeing here is the map, is the projections of the habitat range. One is cod and the other one is lobster. And you can see how it shifted over time. And you can see it in your own, you can see it in your own activity at Gloucester. What I will say, and it's also in the bigger deck, is Gloucester is probably the most active lobster port in Massachusetts. It's a little bit under New Bedford in terms of weight and dollar value, but in terms of harvesters that are working, dealers that are involved in the business, and basically it's a push essentially on the value and weight. It's lobster's very Gloucester is a very important port for Massachusetts lobster industry. The other thing is, and this is one of the bigger questions that we have as we get into the harbor plan, is as the fishery becomes more diverse, is there going to be needs for different kinds of shoreside infrastructure and equipment to handle different kinds of species coming in a port area that's pretty land constrained. So next. And this is some information that had really not been published before. And again, there's more detail in the bigger deck. So this is what I meant by the fishing capacity and activity. So the Mass Marine Commercial Fisheries Division started publishing this report. It lags by 2 years, called the Port Profile Report. And we had a long conversation with them where we worked with them on getting access to the permitting database. And what you see here is permitted harvesters are fishermen. The vessels are home ported, and that's determined by where their address is. Landing trips are essentially what what it is, how many times we're going in and out, and then active permitted harvesters and active dealers. A couple of things that are really important here. One is that when you notice that the permitted harvesters and home ported vessels, Gloucester is bigger than New Bedford in 2018. On the trips, there's more trips being taken place, which implies, and it just relates to what we talked about in the 2013 piece, which is the number of day boats that are active. But the other thing that's also interesting, and this I think goes to the question about how many are being brought in, how many of these boats are being brought into Gloucester. One of the pieces that we're still working with Mass Fisheries on is understanding of the 607 harvesters that are landing in Gloucester, how many of them are Gloucester boats versus non-Gloucester boats, and where are Gloucester boats landing fish? There's a privacy issue, so we work through we're working through an algorithm with them that will allow us to see that, because this is a question that came up the last time as well. We think there's going to be a way to answer this. We do not have this answer right now, but what we do know is that in theory, there are more harvesters landing in Gloucester than there are home ported in Gloucester. What we can't tell you is how many of the home ported people, we can't tell you where they're coming from, and we can't tell you where the Gloucester stuff are landing. Yeah, that's the next piece we're working on. And again, there's some trend data in the background in the bigger deck. Next. So, we have some questions, and these are questions that came up in the last MHP as well. And this is something that at some point as a group probably need to discuss and also talk to the people who are running these operations as well. One of them, there is always, in an infrastructure-based situation, there is always a minimal level of critical mass that's needed. One of the questions that I have is, where is that level of critical mass? And does it change as you move to smaller operations, different kinds of species? And all of these questions are related to that. And then the big question of, if on a more diverse catch and landing in Gloucester, what does that mean for shoreside infrastructure? Do we have to have a different range of shoreside infrastructure to support a more diverse catch? Next. On the seafood industry, processing is mature. It's global. We'll walk through why we think it is shrinking everywhere. It's not just shrinking in Gloucester, it is shrinking across the country on an employment basis. And the number of businesses are actually shrinking as it consolidates, but the wholesale market is expanding. And then there's this thing about Gloucester, about the top 10, 15, and we'll walk you through why we think that. Before you ask the question, I cannot tell you if it's number 10 or if it's number 15. And the reason why is because we don't have data for places in Alaska or Seattle or in Washington or the other, or even in Mississippi, some of the other big landing states and counties. But we know where Essex County sits relative to those counties, and so it's an estimation that you're somewhere in the top 10 to 15. Next. So on a national level, and again, there's more data in the big deck, employment has fallen in the industry across the board. It does not matter which state, whether it's Washington, which is the biggest state, Massachusetts, which is in the top, Florida, it's fallen everywhere. We found about 35,000 jobs. That's down from 40 some thousand, 10 years ago or so. You can see what the average wage there is. Massachusetts has the 46. And then I want to go to the Essex County thing on the chart there. The Essex County piece is interesting. And this is where we came up to the top 10 or 15, again, because we know where the other counties sit, because we have all of the counties in the United States. We have this information for every county in the United States, which is how we were able to do the national county ranks. We know that Gloucester is about 50% of the firms, 90% of the employees, and 93% of the wages in this county because of the work that we've been able to piece together. With that knowledge, that's how we know relative to where the rest of the counties are, Gloucester's bigger than a lot of the big counties in this regard. And that's how we came up with that information.
Kevin, I got a quick question, Tony
Sure.
Chair. Back a few slides ago, you had a much larger, I can't remember if it was income or employees or what, on the seafood side than on the actual fishers side. So where's the seafood being imported from that's coming into Gloucester to have that greater amount of seafood processing than actually, since ours is mostly being exported out? Have you looked at that at all? See what's coming in for that?
No, I mean, and that's going to be really, no, the short answer is no. We were also trying to do that before. My guess is Gorton's is probably the biggest. And where they're sourcing, I can tell you that the vast majority of fish that comes into the Boston region, which includes Gloucester, comes from the West Coast. Either by rail.
I got it. Yeah, Gorton's.
Yeah.
Gorton's really flipped that number. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's
No,
Gorton.
I
So
should've-
most of it comes in.
Yeah.
In some frozen form, or it comes fresh through the Boston, through Logan Airport. We do have those that we can tell you where it's going. We can tell you which country it was originating from as well.
Yeah.
We just don't know it to the level of Gloucester.
Yeah, Gorton's is what's skewed that.
Yeah. And frankly, they're probably one of the reasons why the wages are so high, because of the corporate headquarters functions.
Right.
Next.
Okay, thanks.
And seafood wholesale is a growing sector. Again, you can read that there. It's added nearly 5,000 jobs. It's added 400 plus. It's added 400 businesses. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, take the headphones off. It's added 5,000 jobs nationwide and 400 businesses. Part of that has probably been driven by the massive expansion in imported fish. And you can see the other information there, 2,300 employees statewide, 159. And then you can see the county information. Again, Essex County outperforms all of the other counties. On the wage-based side, it is the second largest. And we know this was a little harder to do because the way the numbers are buried under some different categories, but we're pretty sure that Gloucester is at least 45% of all of the seafood wholesale in the county. It's probably higher than that, but we know that it's at least 45%. Next. And again, it's there's this issue about the investment in seafood industry. This is not to be clear, this is not a regulatory issue, except for potentially maybe the FDA, depending upon how old some of the facilities are and whether they need to be upgraded or not. It is an economic development question because it can be done on the harbor. It's clearly allowed within the DPA. And there is this other question, and you guys would know better than I, but based upon our tour and talking and looking at the businesses, there is a overlap now between seafood processing and seafood wholesale businesses? Does that have implications for infrastructure that we need to think about? Are there, particularly as we start thinking about more diverse species, are there processing technologies that are going to require scales of facilities that may not be possible within the harbor, but could work in somewhere in the uplands, like at the industrial park? And then just the issue around kind of the harbor infrastructure questions again, about how diversity and changing sizes impact infrastructure. Next. So it's pretty seasonal. We're going to show you why we say that. The regional destination, and we're going to show you some cell phone data that kind of helps support that. And again, some of this information, there's more detail in the much bigger deck. This is kind of a summary part. And then there's also some other thing where the downtown and the harbor, particularly for visitors, are kind of integrated, going back to Will's earlier point. And again, that information is not going to be here, but it is in the larger deck. So we converted this away from fiscal years. So for those of you who don't know, the fiscal years typically end in June and begin in July. We converted this to basically try to turn them into calendar years using data from the Massachusetts Department of Revenue that is online, and it only goes back a couple of years. So we weren't able to do this compared to the last harbor plan. As you can see from the hotel tax, and this is pre-Beauport, so that's something very important to remember. It's very, very peaked to the summer. There's not a lot of shoulder season. The meals tax revenue has a little bit more of a gradual decline. And this is and we use this incline and decline, if you will, to kind of estimate how many of the leisure and hospitality jobs were quote unquote tourism versus kind of serving a baseline market, and for we usually define a baseline market as basically, we've done this before in places like Newport and some other places. For this part of the country, January, February, March averages, what that average looks like is kind of what we would say is the baseline. And then on top of that is going to be tourism and, extra activities. And so that's how we adjust. We use that percentage to adjust the leisure and hospitality jobs and some of the retail jobs as well. Next. And this is a cell phone data. This is based upon it's based upon two pings. One ping is when you were in Gloucester, and the second ping is where you were the majority of evenings over a 6-month period, so that they can define, which they use as quote unquote your home. And what you see from this, and this is basically from last July to this July. So there is a COVID thing in this mix, but things were kind of opened up, so it's probably not too bad. And so it's what the visitor pool looks like. And as you can see in that dotted line, it's basically representative of where the Mass Turnpike is. And as you can see, it's kind of a Boston Metro North Shore visitor base, which is a good thing because it presents a lot of opportunity to expand. There's a lot of opportunity to expand that. And then there's more detailed data where it shows that basically 70% of the visitors basically come from Cape Ann and the North Shore. Next. And so, I think one of the big questions here is how do you get more leverage out of tourism, and particularly use some of the money that can be generated from tourism to reinvest back into marine industrial uses. I think there's the Gloucester becoming Newport is probably not realistic given the regulatory issues and the culture of the city in terms of the role that the fishing plays. But there is this growing thing around industrial tourism, and Gloucester's a very authentic place. And I think so there's opportunities there. And the question is there a way to get more gain from one, meaning tourism, that can reinforce the traditional uses of the harbor, which is the water, the the seafood industry and the fishing industry. Next. And I think this is going to Jason, correct?
It is. Thank you, Kevin. I'm Jason Hildrung with Tetra Tech, so happy to be with you here. We've been working and supporting the team on understanding some of the infrastructure elements and how that can help align with and support really the economic strategy that Kevin was just providing the baseline, but kind of moving ahead. Where does that economic strategy move forward, and how can infrastructure help support that from some economic development standpoint? And as we get into that, that raises some resilience issues. So kind of high level, kind of some of the work that we've been doing, and then some of the things that we'll be moving ahead with. At a high level, and some of the questions that were outlined in the scope, there really aren't any deficiencies from a utility standpoint in terms of what is supporting what the activity that's going on in the harbor area. Water is available and it's not limited. The sewer system in particular is important because of thinking about some of the fish processing and how that can play in today and in the future. So there are no real limitations other than just general kind of aging infrastructure and that maintenance updates. One item, electric, that is privately provided by National Grid. They do have their substation in the harbor, and with that, some upgrades are taking place, and that is something to look at. That has been noted as something that's been, there have been constraints in the past, some questions about the future, and its vulnerability during storms. So it's something that we're looking at and coordinating with them. A couple items just to highlight as we look ahead. First is just as we start to get into a little bit more detail, we'll be doing a little bit of analysis on some of that landside support infrastructure, assessing some of the seawalls, some of the piers, other facilities as it may align with that economic strategy. We're trying to zero in a little bit more in terms of how much effort is put into that, because that could be very time consuming when you start inspecting piers and similar. And then the second piece, and Kevin touched on this a little bit about trying to get an understanding of the vessels and the traffic, where is it going, their privacy issues, but we have been working with different resources with Coast Guard and NOAA and trying to get an understanding of that. Kevin mentioned also some with Mass Fish and Wildlife and National Marine Fisheries, but we're trying to get a better sense of kind of the users within the harbor and how that aligns with some of the economics. Next.
Jason, I have a question before we move on.
Sure.
Tony Gross here. You said wastewater. You said you didn't find any need for any pre-treatment or anything. I'm not quite certain what you meant.
Well, from a
Wastewater
municipal
infrastructure was all set. I'm not sure that.
Sure. Well, from a municipal infrastructure, and this, we can touch on this a little bit more later, and probably can touch on it a couple of times as it relates to the economics. But currently, and kind of looking back, I'd say in probably the last 15 years, the municipal wastewater facility has been in a consent decree. They're in the process of closing that out now based on the upgrades that they've been making. So with that said, the current water treatment facility has capacity there. There are other upgrades that are being considered that they will likely be, I think, regulated to make. And that does align with some of the treatment that takes place, the pre-treatment that has to occur with facilities, and that being a challenge around the economics. If that has to be done on site with each of the individuals. So that is a challenge. Yeah, go ahead.
The collection system is, you found that to be up to par.
It is. And with that said, I mean, there are some areas where there's continuing maintenance going on, but the system is in good shape, and they're kind of entering, foreseeing that they'll be coming out of the oversight with the consent decree.
Okay, thanks.
Next slide. Looking a little bit at the federal navigation channels, this is kind of the depths of what this is being managed with the Corps of Engineers. I think one thing to note, this is a old historic harbor, and a lot of these piers and facilities have been here for a long time, and the Corps is maintaining it as they have in the past and will in the future. So not too much more to add on here. Next slide. Unless there's any questions on it. Any questions? No? Raise your hand. Happy to answer this. Looking ahead, we want to look at a few items. This is looking at current flood risk areas, and you can kind of see in light blue. I mean, we're in the harbor, and these areas have gone underwater during different storms over the last number of years. Looking at some of the baseline, there's a 2015 climate change vulnerability assessment that was funded and done by CZM. There's a 2018 update that was part of the municipal vulnerability preparedness plan, which had a more outreach from that. We are waiting for the results of the current work that CZM is doing right now. They're doing a pilot study looking at Gloucester and how to adapt some of the facilities to address some of the flooding. And really, I think a key, descriptor is if we look at that 2015 study, they looked at the harbor area and said, we've got a number of individual parcels here. There's flooding that occurs. That's not, that shouldn't be a surprise given that this harbor area related to marine industrial uses. And what it said was the challenge is within some of the roads, and a lot of the roads take some water on, whether it's Rogers Street, East Main, a lot of the properties do. The challenge is that we've got all of these individual properties, they're privately owned, and to coordinate a collective effort when the public sector doesn't own all of them. The question would be, how do we move some of that ahead? And that's really, I think, some of the subject of what the current CZM study is. So we're waiting to see what is going to come out of that in terms of some of the pilot projects that they're looking at for what can be done with that. Now we've got a couple of maps. If we move ahead, well, actually, while we're on this, I'll just point out, when we go back, I think a couple of things to point out. I mentioned the National Grid substation. Also looking, I know what was raised and kind of heard the challenges on Commercial Street with some of the, and Tony, this might have been what you were asking about too, but some of the sewer facilities and capacity on Commercial Street. A lot of that has been upgraded in the last couple of years since the last plan. That includes the pump station that's out on the point there that's elevated. And so that's a little bit in the harbor area. We've got the water pollution control identified on the edge and talked a little bit about that in terms of the upgrades that have been occurring there. 2015 study said, the water pollution control facility does have vulnerabilities. It does today. It will have more in the future when we look at sea level rise. And it identified a couple of steps to be taken. The city's just gotten a grant and they're actually working on some of those improvements to elevate from the river some of the flooding that occurs from there. So some of those steps are already starting to take place to address some of those future scenarios from increased flooding with the 2030 and 2050 scenarios. And want to highlight that while it's not in the DPA and within the harbor, it gets to that point about pre-treatment, for facilities in the harbor and potential opportunities down the road that if the water treatment facility was upgraded from primary treatment to secondary treatment, it could align with an economic development strategy where some of that pre-treatment that's occurring on site now could actually potentially take place at the facility. So from that flooding standpoint and the challenges there, that's where we start to see some of these opportunities where the infrastructure aligns with some of these investments that need to be made around some of the flooding and resilience issues. So just highlighting here, this is the current flooding. If we go to the next slide, this shows our 2050 scenario. The areas are largely the same, and we've got our next map, which actually shows 2070s. It doesn't change very much. The difference is the depths, so that with that 2050 scenario, that's about 2.5 feet of flooding that's being projected by the state. The 2070, it's about 4.3. And between these two, the thing to highlight here is, that we're looking at a higher scenario here. There's a lot of scenarios that the state's looking at. This is building off the state's new flood modeling for the Eastern Mass flood risk model. This is a high scenario. We could have gone with an intermediate scenario. So in that instance, the 2050 becomes 2070. It doesn't come quite as quickly, but with that, we're being a little bit more aggressive with this because every time we look at these numbers, they go up. So while we might be saying 2050 today, and it might be a high scenario, it might be just a line, and it is something that the city is going to need to address in the future. Next slide. Or any questions on that? I talked a little bit about this already, but just that point about the water pollution control facility, and the improvements being made there, and then also just within the harbor, within the roads, within individual facilities, the need to start looking at really individual parcels, knowing that, particularly, around Harbor Cove, we've got some smaller parcels, and some of these Gloucester, we've got smaller parcels, but then also how that can align with some of the public infrastructure. Next slide. And I think this goes back to Teskena or Will.
Jason, I just had a question about some of the modeling. Is there also just a, like a higher high water modeling just to see where areas will be more regularly inundated versus, obviously extreme events are of concern and their frequency is also a concern, but also just, when things become to the point where they're just not workable on a more regular basis.
No, great question. And that's exactly right. And looking at some of these extremes, there's a difference between that 1% storm that, there's a chance of happening. It could be catastrophic versus what is the more frequent. We can provide that mapping as well in terms of what those challenges are. And I think we have that available too. I'm not sure. I think Nasser may have provided that. Teskena or Zoe can maybe respond to that, but that is available. But that is definitely the bigger challenge. We can pull that for the committee to review just from that standpoint of where those areas are. I'll note, the biggest challenge probably is in the Harbor Cove area. It's some of the things that you see today, with some of the parcels. I think, there's some water in the I-4C2 lot. There's water on Commercial Street, and knowing that those are some of the areas that already experience that today, the frequency with that. And then similarly, some of those around Rocky Neck and East Gloucester, kind of in that zone, which gets a little bit to some of the sub areas that we're going to look at next. But that Harbor Cove and then directly across are the areas where we see some of the most immediate challenges and starting to dive in a little bit deeper with that more frequent flooding.
Yeah, and I can just confirm what Jason said. We do have access to that that sort of projection through Woods Hole, through Nasser, our partner on this work. So we'll be able to share that with the group because it is it's a combination effect, right? It's both the baseline case of where the water will be in sort of typical days, and then also the sort of increased flood risk, both for smaller floods and also storm surge. So we'll sort of flesh that out potentially for the expanded deck that we share later on.
And not to get
also just to Jason and Zoe's point, like this is the 1% map, but the depth, as I think Jason said a little bit elliptically, like you get a sense of where the high water mark is going to be even now, right? Because 10 feet of a 1%, that's a lot of feet for the 1%, but there's a lot of room for that to still be flooded on a much more regular basis for a non-1% storm. So even just the gradient that you see right here gives away a lot of that. The difference for what the high water mark would be that there wouldn't be a rainbow anymore. It would just be yes or no, right?
Yep.
Sorry, Greg, I cut you off. Do you want to ask?
Yeah,
I think
it could be a side conversation with Nasser. I'm very interested in that iteration of modeling just because we We worked with Nasser when he was with another firm on the effort in 2015, and there was one of the limitations was kind of merging those scenarios with the land side elevation data that was kind of not really meshed very well. So I'm just curious about kind of the resolution of this next iteration. So that'll be a side conversation.
Yeah, and we can certainly
Okay,
work with you to kind of refine it. Sort of briefly, just because Nasser did share this with us before, because of the topographic constraints, that's part of why you don't see a big change in the flood extents, but rather you see a change over time in the flood depths within roughly the same area. So that's part of the sort of unique context for Gloucester's flood risk, is that it's relatively geographically constrained by the topography. And so the issue becomes more about flood depth rather than it extending significantly farther.
Right. Thanks.
Okay, so next steps. This is where I sort of bring it back to the idea of what we were talking about before with the idea of the sub areas, right? All these different issues apply in different kinds of ways to the different subzones. And so, you know, you can see on the left here, in addition to the high level discussions about infrastructure and resiliency that we heard about today, we can delve with a little bit more detail into how that affects the different sub areas, right? It's not Americold across the entire harbor planning area, you know, for example, in terms of wharf condition. But there's a lot of other pieces, and some of this may seem familiar from the last plan, but in some cases, the analyses will be different because of, you know, turnover in properties, and in other cases, it might just be more detail. But when it's parcel size, ownership status, the new regulations, how they relate to the DPA, and then also sort of the current status on economic activity and sort of how traffic relates to all that. Those things have shifted over the last 5 years as the broader sort of trends that we talked about have affected different parts of the harbor plan in different ways. So that's sort of where we need to go next. We need to start spatializing a lot of these more sort of harbor-wide conditions that you've been hearing about today, which means that it's also worth just noting, as we go further, there is, you know, it says here that we're calling it the fork in the road. And in many ways, the fork, to mix the metaphors, there's some version of like the tines of that fork, the degree to which we look at both of them, right? You know, it's right here, the economic strategy versus the regulatory plan. This is the regulatory plan. So the planning process itself that we're looking at is one of the two pieces of the fork. But in many cases, what we've been talking about, what we've been hearing from you all, often relates to the higher level economic strategy that isn't what the specific project is about. However, the broader economic strategies are not totally decoupled from the regulatory plan. And so that's going to be something which we have to thread a needle on. Now I'm really mixing them up as we're working on the project, right? Because we, to the extent that the things we're talking about will be what gets written in the MHP, there may be a somewhat limited scope. But a big piece of this will be making sure that it either doesn't preclude or in fact aligns and pushes forward some of the bigger ideas that the city has to be working on addressing. And so that's where this map comes in, right? We talked at great length at a previous meeting about, you know, the difference between the DPA and Chapter 91 and all the different regulatory constraints. Not only is there that very complicated overlay of how the different rules affect one another on a parcel by parcel basis, but also the degree to which those different regulatory regimes are present in different parts of the harbor itself is a very varied thing, right? And so you can see the map, but it means that we have sort of 4 ways that things happen. You could be in the DPA in Chapter 91, in the DPA out of Chapter 91, out in and out in, out, right? And so that itself is also a big part of what separates some of these sub areas from one another. And so just as sort of a final next step.
Just a
yeah.
second, go back to that back slide, just for, I'm noticing just a couple anomalies. So the East Gloucester Americold. So the majority of that property is not Chapter 91. Is that correct?
If I'm getting it right, you mean on the backside, the
say-
non-water, the non.
The East Gloucester site.
Oh, sorry, brain. Yes, I think that's correct.
Well, both sites.
Chapter 90, yeah.
And then also, what's that little spot that's just curious, but what's that little spot at the Coast Guard station?
On the fish pier.
No, that's the old
Yeah,
Five Pound Island.
Or islands in brief, that's what it, in terms of conceptualizing it, the Chapter 91 is sort of a derivative of the sort of historic coastline. And so those places where you see essentially like an island
Yeah,
floating within it, that's an area that
was
was
not
land
built.
was.
when the rest was water.
It's a combination of a whole, I forget exactly when, was
Well, the Chapter
before it
91
became an
fulfilled
urban
title.
planner.
Right, so it was never really formally flowed tideline. There was kind of a
Didn't have
little
to be
outcrop.
filled, yeah. Yeah,
A
no, I
small
understand
spot of
that.
non-tide land.
No, I understand that. I just thought it interesting because, and does the wharf on the East Gloucester site have a Chapter 91 of Americold?
You mean a license?
Do they have their wharf? Do they have a Chapter 91 for that wharf? Because I've been informed that they might not.
So what we don't have, this is just purely the jurisdictional line. There's no easy way to access sort of online,
Okay.
list
I don't
all
mean
the
to
different
devolve
Chapter
this
91
into-
whatevers.
We can
No,
move
it's
on.
a great question. Basically, it's worth just saying very quickly, just before I forget, basically, what we had easy access to is whether it's jurisdictional or not. When it comes to things like specific Chapter 91 licenses, conditions associated with that stuff, that's where like discussions with CZM become really, really important, because that sort of just lives as like case law kind of in a somewhat opaque way. And so when we get into specific pieces, like the details matter a lot, but that's never going to be shown on the map.
Very briefly,
But
Tony,
yes,
just
thank you, Travis.
as you were talking, I was just looking at the exact location. If I'm not mistaken, it's right at you see that sort of portion. Let me see if I don't think I can annotate. 1 second.
Oh, can I?
So yeah, so like right here, are you able to see that circle on the screen?
Yes.
Yep, yeah, I can see that.
So generally speaking, that's the area that the Americold facility is in, if I'm not mistaken. And so
Correct.
it is kind of right in a bit of a gray area in the sense that it's right on the edge. And it does have sort of Chapter 91 cuts through it. So you can see the shoreline in this white line right here. That's sort of the NOAA shoreline data. So you can see that there's sort of a bit of a crossover there where you have, it's land side and there is a bit of Chapter 91.
And Tony, we can check our records, and it is of all the databases out there of permits and licenses, it's probably one of the, it's just not very well maintained. We have records here because in modern process, the planning board and the zoning enforcement officer get notified of license requests. So we maintain everything that's been of recent history. The harbor master's office also has some record of licenses, and then otherwise it's DEP, and it is often, it's like doing a title search to try to figure out what's been licensed or not, because they tend to keep things by license number or sometimes by application number. And so, as some of these properties have been modified over time, they actually will license the different activities. They don't always just revisit the license as a whole. So it's a long answer of, we could certainly see what is and what isn't, but it may also require circling back to DEP.
Yeah, the only reason I bring it up is because it's a recurring question with with citizens of Gloucester of, Americold and its waste of a Chapter 91. Does it have a Chapter 91? It's just a recurring question. That's all. Okay, thanks.
I mean, if you want, I think we could probably find that for you, find out whether they have one or not have one.
It'd be great if we could find out on the entire harbor, because there's some that.
I'm not committing to that. I said.
Okay. Thank you.
There are probably 1,000 licenses on the harbor. So, but if that one property is of special concern to you, I'm happy to try to track that one down.
All right. Okay, so I'm gonna go, any other questions on this before I go to the next one? Seeing, okay, next one. So as a final point, you know, there's a couple different pieces, right? There's where we meet with you next, which is how we go from baseline conditions to actual strategy. That's sort of the next big piece, right? So we still have a date, but let's say in the realm of October, that'll be our next meeting. And the two big things which we as a planning team are going to work on are, one, not just talking to you all in terms of outreach, but actually doing additional work with property and business owners to figure out sort of their concerns and have a similar set of conversations with them. And then also using that as a time for a public visioning workshop. I mean, fingers crossed, there's a lot of issues about, you know, making sure we get the minutes to proceed and everything, but that's kind of what we're shooting for. And then separate from the sort of engagement piece of it, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, we're going to go from the broad level analyses to start getting a little bit more detailed into activities, spatial things about the harbor. As the new data comes in, taking a look at that whenever it becomes available, and then sort of just pushing all the stuff forward. So I believe that is the last slide. And so then what I'm going to do, unless anyone wants me to bring up another thing, I'm going to turn off my screen sharing so we can all see each other's lovely faces. And I think we have time for questions and comments. And just as a note for everyone as a time check, it is 3:12, and we have, you know, until 3:30 on the books.
Any questions from the committee?
Tony,
Yeah. Go ahead, Joe.
one quick question on some of the permitting numbers that you had, permitting landing numbers, and Vito might actually be able to chip in here. A lot of the boats lease quota, I mean, is there a chance that we are skewing the numbers there because there are multi-permits on boats?
I'm pausing to make sure that I answered the question right. No, because it's actual fish landed in the way that Massachusetts reports it, which is a little bit differently than NOAA, but the numbers are pretty close, are based upon what the from vendor reports. So it should be the actual pounds. I don't think it's going to be skewed by boats with different permits. Or are you saying the question about the number of the vessels, is that being skewed? Is that
That's what I'm asking. The number,
Okay.
it seemed high to me, the number of vessels landing, and I just wondered if that number was being skewed at all by multi-permits on boats.
I will check.
Thank you.
Briefly, just as kind of a prompt for discussion, we've sort of identified these sub areas in part through our conversations with you and with other stakeholders and through our initial analysis, but would certainly welcome feedback on them. So if you have any thoughts, feel free to speak up.
And I'm just noting that Vito is following the very polite convention of raising his hand. So recognize Vito.
Sorry, Vito. Vito, go ahead.
So just quickly to that question about whether the numbers could be skewed by leased permits, I believe all the data is coming out of landings data. So for instance, if someone had no quota at all, or if they, as long as you landed and filed, then that's basically that one participant gets counted as one. Even if he uses multiple permits, it would be whatever permit is associated with the vessel, which there can only be one permit associated with one vessel. So I would think that it's probably the lobster fleet. There's quite a few vessels there as far as in numbers. So I wouldn't doubt that those numbers are accurate as far as the numbers of vessels. But I had a general question At the last meeting, we talked about the complication of water dependent use zone and how that was dealt with in the 2014 harbor plan. So I'm just wondering, I know now we're talking about not meeting until October, but from myself personally, I feel like there are some fundamental things that we'd love to understand and hope that you folks are going to dig into them and be able to report to us on having a better understanding of application. One was the water dependent use zone. The other one, I believe I found today in the harbor plan, rereading it. I met with some folks and there was confusion about whether the 50% supporting use was on a property by property basis, or if it was at the full DPA delineation basis. And I believe it's both. The way I read it, we still meet it's actually 28%, I think, would be supporting use if we use the same calculations that we have now. And that's because of the fish pier, the Coast Guard. You know, I've looked at the formulas. So basically it means that the remainder of the private properties would be limited to, but could go up to 50% supporting use. And it wouldn't be a first come, first serve where some large property comes in and applies for a larger percentage, and that would somehow be tokens taken off the table for other property owners. These were property owners that were concerned about that likelihood. And I assured them I would find out for them if that's the case. I did my own research, and I think definitively it's a property by property, but I also saw a letter from the mayor, from Carolyn Kirk at the time as inquiry to CZM. And it seemed as though it was described differently, as though it was, you know, there's 50% left out there for the remaining 11 acres, and whoever gets it first, you know, that it doesn't matter. We would still meet the 28% supporting use. To me, that's a really fundamental, important question to definitively lay out there. And then there's discussion about relief in the water dependent use zone regulations, and that was removed from, Greg, correct me if I'm wrong, removed from the marine industrial portion so that there wasn't conflict, or vice versa. Where does the relief in the water dependent use zone that's in the state regs get to have municipal deference?
So I'll just give you my quick take, and I'm also seeing Catherine in the audience raising her hand. But I think you're correct in that, you know, the overall approvability standard is that 25% allowance harbor wide, and because of the analysis that was performed that demonstrated, you know, some of those, you know, if all things stay the same in terms of some of the water dependent uses like the fish pier, like you know, others that seem that they will remain established as water dependent uses, that those other areas could use up to 50%, and that's up to 50% of the area in jurisdiction. And then those areas that are outside of jurisdiction are subject to local zoning. So I think you're correct in that it's not, you know, one user or one site could say, I'm going to go to 75% supporting use, and that's not going to upset the apple cart in terms of calculation. It's each individual site can go up to 50% to the extent that it complies and gets licensed. And then the other question was around water dependent use zone, which I thought was really the ability to modify the water dependent use zone on a site based on some of its limitations. As you know, if it's very broadly applied, in some instances, it occupies a large portion of a site, particularly if it's long and narrow, for instance. So I think it was, I don't know that it's ever, I haven't seen a licensed use that really capitalized on that, but I think the allowance was provided for that there may be a way to modify the water dependent use zone on a site. And maybe if I recognize Catherine through the vice chair, she might be able to elaborate on that further.
Great, thanks, Greg. Yeah, I want to reiterate what Greg just said. So Vito, there's really a couple of standards when it comes to it's a little bit confusing sometimes with the supporting use and the commercial use. So for a designated port area master plan, you have to demonstrate that as a general rule, no more than 25% of the designated port area, all the land area of the designated port area will be used for commercial use under your master plan in terms of how you're approaching it. So for Gloucester, the 50% is 50% for all parcels other than those that are specifically stated to be held at 100%. So the State Fish Pier and the Coast Guard and Cruise Port. It also held the roads, and also all of the pile held piers were held to 100%. So that left it so that if every other parcel in the DPA used half of their area in jurisdiction for supporting uses, it would still mean that overall there was less than 25, there was 25% or less of the jurisdictional area used for supporting uses, but it also meant that you were pretty close to that 25% requirement for commercial uses overall in the DPA. So it's, there are a couple of different standards, and that can be a little bit confusing because there's a Chapter 91 standard of 25% within jurisdiction. And then there's the DPA master plan standard, which is, as a general rule, no more than 25% commercial. So both need to be met when we're at the end of the day with our DPA master plan for this harbor plan. We'll need to have a DPA master plan that meets both of those standards, and we'll need to take a good look at that. So I think we will need to go back over this particular standard. And then Greg is right that the water dependent use zone was allowed to be amended if, under certain circumstances with certain, caveats for depending on the parcel. And that was done by, license by license basis, making sure that it's, it meets all of the requirements. So that's there. I don't know that the city has anything, and Greg, you'll know better than I do, but whether the city has anything that sort of puts that in place as well, or if I don't think there's any conflict there between the city and the state for that I'm aware of.
No, I think we cross-reference the regulations, and then also as they're modified by the master plan. So it's really just sitting there in terms of the language of interpretation is in the existing harbor plan.
Great.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
One thing that I just want to make people aware of as we're starting, there was some, I think, discussion maybe when I spoke to Katie about past presentations and materials and information. And I think we mentioned it at the last meeting, and I'm trying to remember if we were right on the cusp of launching the website at the last meeting. But we do now have a standalone website, if everyone can see that. It's harborplan.gloucester-ma.gov, and you can bookmark that. We are kind of using it as another way to outreach as we get further along in the process. If there are components of outreach that include survey or the ability to leave comment and that type of thing, we'll utilize this platform. But also what it will keep track of is past events, the recording of the meeting in the event that you missed one, and also the presentation that was provided at the meeting. And also Kevin made reference to a larger slide deck with a lot more information on the economic baseline that, again, is going to evolve again. So we're going to have to date stamp these as well. But we will be using this as the place to kind of post all information related to the site. You may also, get from time to time, either a presentation or some draft material distributed via email or with a link. But we are going to kind of use this site as a clearinghouse of really kind of tracing all the steps of the process as we move forward. Again, official posting will always be through the website. You'll either receive a link or we'll meet in person at some point potentially. And that's kind of an ongoing discussion right now. So it may be depending upon how things look, our next meeting could be in person, but we'll certainly make you aware of that if that's the case. So I just wanted to make sure people bookmark that. Again, if you missed any presentation materials or want to go back and look at them, they'll all be attached to the event on the website. And as well, there's also background materials, past harbor plan, past information that will also is already populated on the site and will continue to be developed further.
Greg, if somebody goes to the city's website, where would they find this?
So currently there is there's both a harbor plan committee website, and there is also harbor planning through community development. So if you kind of hit at it through multiple ways, if somebody just put harbor in the search button as well, they'll be taken to all those places that it'll link to. But off of the harbor plan committee web page is probably also a good one for anyone that's starting to follow the process. We are also trying to keep track of people that want to stay engaged and involved. So there's also the ability to provide feedback or comment through the harbor plan website that's been set up, so that as we get to either stakeholder engagement or community forum, that we can start to kind of hit that audience that's interested as well as beyond.
Thank you. Go ahead, Tom. Tom, you're muted. All right.
Thanks. So there's a lot of great information that was presented today. I really appreciate it. As we have questions or suggestions for additional data or other things, what's either Tony or Greg or somebody, what's the process for?
You can always funnel things through our office. You can send things directly to me. If you have questions or you want something, we can provide that feedback loop to make sure that questions as you review it, because again, this was the subset. It's going to be a larger body of information to review, and as you have questions around that, you can circulate them to us, and then we can get back into the public forum and kind of resolve those questions.
The other question I have is as it relates to the maps and the sort of topical areas. I would love to see, and I recognize this isn't a sort of a boundary review where you're looking at marine dependent uses and supporting uses, etc. But, some level of granularity about what is happening in those areas. And so we can understand sort of the process connections between those areas. Is that something that can be incorporated within the scope, or is that not a reasonable expectation?
I think there will be further granularity, let's put it that way. And I think the intention was to just create some broader groupings of areas where the parcels have similar conditions and kind of, let's call them economic or regulatory challenges. And I think within each of those areas, we've heard stories of particularly relevant properties that we might zoom into. But I think collectively they will make up a kind of broader approach. But I think for the purposes of planning, and in a spatial sense, it was just useful to kind of subdivide these things into sort of, let's call them character areas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Any more questions?
So Tony, I think I'm also noting that Catherine has her hand raised again, and we also have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 participants. So I'll recognize Catherine, and then if you want to take any public comment, that's at your discretion.
Okay. Catherine?
Thanks. I just wanted to remind everybody that we are coming up too, I know, Greg, you might want to just mention the request for notice to proceed to actually start the state process. A lot of what we're doing is, going to be included in the state's notice to proceed in terms of here's what needs to be in that document. And then once the city has submitted their request for a notice to proceed, that will be noticed in the environmental monitor, and there'll be a public comment period for 30 days. So that will happen. My guess is that will happen before the October meeting. So I just wanted to make sure that everyone's aware of that, and that is coming up and will be a pretty key part of the process.
Thank you, Catherine. Sure, Greg, you have the magic hand there, so I'll let people in. Anyone of the public wants to comment? You're muted, Greg.
Rookie move. Can't believe I was muted. So I was just saying we have members from the public, Valerie Nelson, Marcia Hart, Patty Page, and Tom Berger, and Valerie has her hand raised, and I will allow her to speak. Nope.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. I hope you can hear me.
Oh, okay. I thought you disappeared for a second.
No.
We can hear you. Yep.
Okay, great. So Kevin, that was terrific information, actually quite encouraging about the fishing industry, but I wanted to ask if you intend to, since at the last harbor plan, it was a big deal that research activities were now allowed as eligible, within the CPA. Are you going to put a similar amount of focus into the economic development prospects for more research and development? For example, in the last budget, there was some mention from Anne Margaret Ferrante about a seafood processing center of excellence. And Bruce Tarr has put into bond bills fuel efficient boat building. So you didn't really mention a thorough look at the prospects for more R&D in the harbor. And is that you just haven't done it, or that and you will, or where does that stand?
We will. Part of it is we're waiting. Hi, Valerie, by the way, nice to hear you again. Part of it is we're waiting for the Blue Economy Report to come out to see what that stuff looks like. The other part is that this was just a baseline of kind of where we're starting from, not necessarily where we're headed. And so I think once we get through some of the regulatory questions and how land issues, all of this will unfold, but that would clearly be something that would be on the agenda.
That's of interest to a lot of us, so thank you.
Yep.
So any more, Greg?
No, Tony, I don't see any more.
Okay, thank you, Joe. I've not had the luxury of seeing the agenda, so I can pull it up on another device or finding it on another device without being distracted. So how are we doing on the agenda, Greg?
I think that about covers it. Again, for the timing piece, I think, I'm very cognizant of Catherine's point, and Matt and I will probably close that loop this week to hopefully get that notice to proceed out. There is a little bit more work that the team will be doing over the next, and again, we are in August. I'm actually amazed that this meeting came off as it did, because there were a lot of passing ships over the last 3 weeks. And, again, a lot of information, a lot of encouraging information, but also it's, now what do we do with it? And that's really the harbor planning piece. So I feel very comfortable that we've been doing a lot of the baselining work. That's really just, kind of bringing everybody to the same level playing field before we start to really engage in the heavier part of the harbor planning process. And what we will hope to do, the time frame of it will depend on everyone else's schedule in terms of stakeholder engagement. Similar to the types of meetings that we conducted with the members of the committee, we'll be starting that outreach with property owners and business owners. And it will be, again, you know, it'll be a great way to kind of add to, you know, here's what a database says is going on, to hearing from people that are actually in these businesses on the waterfront, and how they perceive, you know, how they've been doing over the last 5 years. We might get an entirely different story. Certainly, we'll probably get a diversity of stories. So that's what we'll plan on doing with the team over probably the next 4 to 6 weeks. So it's probably a little bit more of a stay tuned on a date for the next Harbor Plan Committee meeting. And you'll also have the expanded slide deck from today. And again, as you have questions and comments surrounding that, you could feed that back through my office. And it may be that we'll just, you know, set a meeting for, you know, for a clarifying session on that data in the interim as a committee. Nope, Tony, you're muted.
Is it time for the motion to adjourn?
You can take a motion to adjourn.
I'll entertain a motion to adjourn by one of the members. Tom, unmute.
So moved.
Unmute. Vito moved. You second, Tom?
A second.
All right, we have to do this by roll call.
Roll call.
Yeah.
Member Bal,
Yes.
Member Gigaloni,
Yes.
Member Brown,
Yes.
Member Gross,
Yes.
Member Call,
Yes.
and Member McCarthy.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. And you got to stay inside because it's hot out there, but try to stay cool.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.